Hello! Welcome to the podcast, There Is No Spoon. In this episode, we will focus on past traumas. One of the first questions that arises when reflecting on one's life story is, how should we analyze it? Various psychological approaches, and sometimes even individual authors, offer their own frameworks for such an inquiry. There is no single right or wrong way, aside from methods that are clearly harmful. But some form of structure is necessary. This structure is not meant to serve as a rigid analytical tool, but rather to present different perspectives on past experiences. The choice of method depends on the individual and their circumstances, and it can even be modified to suit one's needs. In this episode, we will discuss the classification proposed by Jungian analyst James Hollis. Much of his work is dedicated to analyzing the ghosts of the past, those forces that cause old stories to replay over and over again. A person standing at the midpoint of life must begin the process of freeing themselves from these ghosts so that their future path is no longer dictated by ancestors, parents, traditions, culture, or social strata, but becomes uniquely their own. As long as these ghosts guide us, we participate in someone else's myth rather than creating our own, which is, in a sense, the task of the second half of life. So let's begin. To start, let's consider why past events continue to influence our present decisions. A child's behavior is largely shaped by their environment. Often, it is based on imitating significant others, parents, family friends, or authority figures. This imitation does not just instill certain skills and habits, but also forms fundamental beliefs about the world. Hollis writes that a child, among other things, observes the behavior of the big people, their ways of adapting and surviving, to determine for themselves the nature of the surrounding world. What is my world like? Safe, caring, reliable, or indifferent, hostile, full of problems? The answers to these questions become deeply embedded beliefs that shape how a person, as a teenager and later as an adult, interacts with the world. Someone who sees the world as hostile and unjust is unlikely to approach others with openness and trust. This can be compared to a system of axioms from which all theorems follow. The axioms one chooses will determine the kind of world they construct. Add the fifth postulate, and you get classical Euclidean geometry, remove it, and you have the geometries of Lobachevsky, Riemann, or Minkowski. There is no single correct geometry, just as there are no inherently right or wrong beliefs, but the foundation determines the outcome. Why do we examine early experiences? A simple answer is that we study them to avoid repeating past mistakes. While this is sometimes the case, not every pattern is easy to change, and not every pattern needs to be changed. The primary goal of such self-exploration is to increase awareness in decision-making. A person may consciously decide not to change a certain behavior, recognizing that addressing it would require too many resources at the moment. However, after reflection, this decision is made with awareness, understanding both the potential negative and positive consequences. Now let's move on to Hollis's classification. This trauma is rooted in a simple realization. I am small, and the world is big. I am weak, and the world is strong. Hollis says that the first category of unavoidable existential childhood trauma can be called overwhelming trauma, the experience of fundamental helplessness in the face of one's environment. This overwhelming presence can stem from intrusive parental authority, socioeconomic pressures, biological inadequacy, large-scale global events, and so on. But the central message remains the same: powerlessness to change the external world. To identify whether this trauma plays a role in one's life, one can analyze their thoughts and reactions to certain situations. Hollis outlines 3 typical responses to overwhelming trauma: flight, fight, and adaptation. Flight. This response manifests as avoidance, procrastination, or denial. The person unconsciously reasons, The world is bigger and stronger. I am weaker. How do I protect myself? The answer: retreat into one's shell and hope the danger passes. Fight. This involves an attempt to combat helplessness through hyper-control and over-organization. Instead of accepting the world as it is, the person tries to reshape it according to their own ideals. This can lead to authoritarian tendencies, as those who resist such control become obstacles to be removed. Adaptation. This is the most deceptive response because it appears socially acceptable. The person becomes highly adaptable, seamlessly fitting into societal expectations. However, in doing so, they risk losing their authentic self, buried beneath layers of social roles. Another type of existential trauma is deficiency trauma. Hollis defines it as the belief that one cannot rely on the external world to meet emotional needs. 3 common defense mechanisms arise from this trauma. Magical thinking. The belief that one's worth is determined by how others treat them. This often manifests in children who internalize adult problems, blaming themselves for family issues, such as parental divorce. Overcompensation. The individual attempts to fill an internal void with external achievements, wealth, status, power. However, since the void is internal, it cannot be resolved by external means. Seeking validation from others. This often manifests as hopeless love, where an individual repeatedly enters relationships expecting others to fulfill their unmet emotional needs, ultimately pushing partners away in the process. By midlife, this tendency can be exacerbated by existential isolation, a form of loneliness that cannot be overcome through social interaction alone. No person or external entity can fill the void except the individual themselves. To sum up, there are 2 fundamental types of childhood trauma: overwhelming trauma and deficiency trauma. Overwhelming trauma is characterized by a sense of the world's power and one's own weakness. Deficiency trauma stems from the belief that others cannot be relied upon to meet one's needs. Each trauma leads to a specific defense mechanism that influences adult behavior. By identifying these patterns, one can trace them back to their origins. That's where we'll end this episode. This was the podcast, There Is No Spoon. Until next time.